Happy Halloween, everybody. I hope you're ready for some spooky, spine-tingling tales. Just a quick warning. This program is for kids around ages 10 to 14, or maybe 8 or 9 if you really like scary stories. So we're going to start off with one that'll give a good example of what I mean. A poem that may sound a little familiar if you have ever read Hansel and Gretel. So here we go, everybody. You are food. You are here for me to eat. Fatten up, and I will like you better. Your brother will be first. You must wait your turn. Feed him yourself, you will learn to do it. You will take him eggs with yellow sauce, muffins torn apart and leaking butter, fried meats late in the morning, and always sweets in a sticky parade from the kitchen. His vigilance, an ice pick of hunger pricking his insides, will melt in the unctuous cream fillings. He will forget. He will thank you for it. His little finger, stuck every day through cracks in the bars, will grow sleek and round, his hollow face swell like the moon. He will stop dreaming about fear in the woods without food. He will lean toward the maw of the oven as it opens every afternoon, sighing better and better smells. That was The Witch Has Told You a Story by Leavell Haymon. So while we're talking about witches, I have another story to share with you. This one is a selection from a book called The Witches by Roald Dahl, who also wrote Charlie and the Chocolate Factory and Matilda, among others. But this is his creepiest book, and I really loved it when I was a kid. So this, I'm not going to read you the whole thing, because as you can see, it's pretty long. But in this chapter, our hero has just been spying on a convention of witches and watched them turn another boy into a mouse. Now, witches in this story can smell children, and they smell awful to witches. So he's hiding, and he knows that they've caught his scent, and he's locked in the room with all of these witches. And let's see what happens next. This chapter is called The Metamorphosis. I remember thinking to myself, there is no escape for me now. Even if I make a run for it and manage to dodge the lot of them, I still won't get out because the doors are chained and locked. I'm finished. I'm done for. Oh, Grandmama, what are they going to do to me? I looked round and saw a hideous, painted and powdered witch's face staring down at me, and the face opened its mouth and yelled triumphantly, "It's here! It's behind the screen! Come and get it!" The witch reached out a gloved hand and grabbed me by the hair, but I twisted free and jumped away. I ran, oh how I ran! The sheer terror of it all put wings on my feet. I flew around the outside of the great ballroom, and not one of them had a chance of catching me. As I came level with the doors, I paused and tried to open them, but the big chain was on them, and they didn't even rattle. The witches were not bothering to chase me. They simply stood there in small groups, watching me, and knowing for certain that there was no way I could escape. Several of them were holding their noses with gloved fingers, and there were cries of, "Woof! What a stink! We can't stand this much longer." "Catch it then, you idiots!" screamed the Grand High Witch from up on the platform. "Spread out in a line across the room and close in on it and grab it. Corner this filthy little gumboil and seize it and bring it up here to me." The witches spread out as they were told. They advanced toward me, some from one end, some from the other, and some came down the middle between the rows of empty chairs. They were bound to get me now. They had me cornered. From sheer and absolute terror, I began to scream, "Help, help, help!" "Get it!" shouted the Grand High Witch. "Grab hold of it, stop it yelling!" They rushed at me then, and about 5 of them grabbed me by the arms and legs and lifted me clear off the ground. I went on screaming, but one of them clapped a gloved hand over my mouth, and that stopped me. "Bring it here," shouted the Grand High Witch. "Bring the spine-lit worm up here to me." I was carried onto the platform with my arms and legs held tight by many hands, and I lay there suspended in the air, facing the ceiling. I saw the Grand High Witch standing over me, grinning at me in the most horrible way. She held up the small blue bottle of mouse maker, and she said, "Now for a little medicine. Hold his nose to make him open his mouth." Strong fingers pinched my nose. I kept my mouth closed tight and held my breath, but I couldn't do it for long. My chest was bursting. I opened my mouth to get one big, quick breath of air, and as I did so, the Grand High Witch poured the entire contents of the little bottle down my throat. Oh, the pain and the fire! It felt as though a kettle full of boiling water had been poured into my mouth. My throat was going up in flames. Then very quickly, the frightful burning, searing, scorching feeling started spreading down into my chest and into my tummy and on into my arms and legs and all over my body. I screamed and screamed, but once again the gloved hand was clapped over my lips. The next thing I felt was my skin beginning to tighten. How else can I describe it? It was quite literally a tightening and a shrinking of the skin all over my body from the top of my head to the tips of my fingers to the end of my toes. I felt as though I was a balloon and somebody was twisting the top of the balloon and twisting, and the balloon was getting smaller and smaller and the skin was getting tighter and tighter, and soon it was going to burst. Then the squeezing began. This time I was inside a suit of iron, and somebody was turning a screw, and with each turn of the screw, the iron suit became smaller and smaller, so that I was squeezed like an orange into a pulpy mess with the juice running out of my sides. After that, there came a fierce, prickling sensation all over my skin, or what was left of my skin, as though tiny needles were forcing their way out through the surface of the skin from the inside, and this, I realize now, was the growing of the mouse fur. Far away in the distance, I heard the voice of the Grand High Witch yelling, 500 doses! This stinking little carbuncle has had 500 doses, and the alarm clock has been smashed, and now we are having instantaneous action. I heard clapping and cheering, and I remember thinking, I am not myself any longer. I have gone clear out of my own skin. I noticed also a pair of little furry front paws resting on the floor. I was able to move those paws. They were mine. At that moment, I realized that I was not a little boy any longer. I was a mouse. Now for the mouse trap, I heard the Grand High Witch yelling. I've got it right here, and here's a piece of cheese. But I wasn't going to wait for that. I was off across the platform like a streak of lightning. I was astonished at my own speed. I leapt over Witch's feet right and left, and in no time at all I was down the steps and onto the floor of the ballroom itself and skittering off among the rows of chairs. What I especially liked was the fact that I made no sound at all as I ran. I was a swift and silent mover. And quite amazingly, the pain had all gone now. I was feeling quite remarkably well. It is not a bad thing, after all, I thought to myself, to be tiny as well as speedy, when there's a bunch of dangerous females after your blood. I selected the back leg of a chair and squeezed up against it and kept very still. In the distance, the Grand High Witch was shouting, "Leave the little stinkpot alone. It is not worth bothering about. It is only a little mouse now. Somebody else will catch it. Let us get out of here. The meeting is over. Unlock the doors and shove off to the Sunshine Terrace to have tea with that idiotic manager." And that is the end of Metamorphosis from the Witches, which I always think is one of the most deliciously creepy passages in all of children's books. Now, this story comes from one of my favorite short story writers ever, Ray Bradbury. A lot of his stories are sci-fi or fantasy. This one is definitely horror and definitely creepy. Now, this one I picked for 2020 because it's called Fever Dream. So, if you think that a story about a terrible plague would be just the kind of creepy you need right now, go for it. If you think maybe that's a little close to home right now, you can always skip this story and go on to the next one. But here we have Fever Dream by Ray Bradbury. They put him between fresh, clean, laundered sheets, and there was always a newly squeezed glass of thick orange juice on the table under the dim pink lamp. All Charles had to do was call, and Mom or Dad would stick their heads into his room to see how sick he was. The acoustics of the room were fine. You could hear the toilet gargling its porcelain throat of mornings. You could hear rain tap the roof, or sly mice run in the secret walls, or the canary singing in its cage downstairs. If you were very alert, sickness wasn't too bad. He was 13, Charles was. It was mid-September, with the land beginning to burn with autumn. He lay in the bed for 3 days before the terror overcame him. His hand began to change. His right hand. He looked at it, and it was hot and sweating, there on the counterpane alone. It fluttered. It moved a bit. Then it lay there, changing color. That afternoon, the doctor came again and tapped his thin chest like a little drum. "How are you?" asked the doctor, smiling. "I know, don't tell me. My cold is fine, doctor, but I feel awful. Ha!" He laughed at his own oft-repeated joke. Charles lay there, and for him, that terrible and ancient jest was becoming a reality. The joke fixed itself in his mind. His mind touched and drew away from it in a pale terror. The doctor did not know how cruel he was with his jokes. "Doctor," whispered Charles, lying flat and colorless, "my hand, it doesn't belong to me anymore. This morning it changed into something else. I want you to change it back. Doctor, doctor!" The doctor showed his teeth and patted his hand. "It looks fine to me, son. You've just had a little fever dream." "But it changed, doctor. Oh, doctor," cried Charles, pitifully holding up his pale, wild hand. "It did." The doctor winked. "I'll give you a pink pill for that." He popped a tablet onto Charles's tongue. "Swallow." "Will it make my hand change back and become me again?" "Yes, yes." The house was silent when the doctor drove off down the road in his car under the quiet, blue September sky. A clock ticked far below in the kitchen world. Charles lay looking at his hand. It did not change back. It was still something else. The wind blew outside. Leaves fell against the cool window. At 4 o'clock, his other hand changed. It seemed almost to become a fever. It pulsed and shifted, cell by cell. It beat like a warm heart. The fingernails turned blue and then red. It took about an hour for it to change, and when it finished, it looked just like any ordinary hand. But it was not ordinary. It no longer was him anymore. He lay in a fascinated horror and then fell into an exhausted sleep. Mother brought the soup up at 6. He wouldn't touch it. "I haven't any hands," he said, his eyes shut. "Your hands are perfectly good," said Mother. "No," he wailed, "my hands are gone. I feel like I have stumps. Oh, Mama, hold me, I'm scared." She had to feed him herself. "Mama," he said, "get the doctor, please, again, I'm so sick." "The doctor will be here tonight at 8, she said, and went out. At 7, with night dark and close around the house, Charles was sitting up in bed when he felt the thing, happening to first one leg, and then the other. "Mama, come quick!" he screamed. But when Mama came, the thing was no longer happening. When she went downstairs, he simply lay without fighting, as his legs beat and beat, grew warm, red hot, and the room filled with the warmth of his feverish change. The glow crept up from his toes to his ankles and then to his knees. "May I come in?" The doctor smiled in the doorway. "Doctor!" cried Charles. "Hurry, take off my blankets!" The doctor lifted the blankets tolerantly. "There you are, whole and healthy. Sweating, though. A little fever. I told you not to move around, bad boy." He pinched the moist pink cheek. "Did the pills help? Did your hand change back?" No, it's my other hand and my legs." Well, I'll have to give you 3 more pills, 1 for each limb, my little peach," laughed the doctor. "Will they help me? Please, what have I got?" "A mild case of scarlet fever, complicated by a slight cold." "Is it a germ that lives and has more little germs in me?" "Yes." "Are you sure it's scarlet fever? You haven't taken any tests." "I guess I know a certain fever when I see one," said the doctor, checking the little boy's pulse with cool authority. Charles lay there, not speaking, until the doctor was crisply packing his black kit. Then in the silent room, the boy's voice made a small, weak pattern, his eyes alight with remembrance. "I read a book once about petrified trees, wood turning to stone, about how trees fell and rotted and minerals got in and built up, and they look just like trees, but they're not. They're stone." He stopped. In the quiet, warm room, his breathing sounded. "Well?" asked the doctor. "I've been thinking," said Charles, after a time. "Do germs ever get big? I mean, in biology class they told us about one-celled animals, amoebas and things, and how millions of years ago they got together until there was a bunch, and they made the first body. And more cells got together and got bigger, and then finally maybe there was a fish, and finally here we are. And all we are is a bunch of cells that decided to get together to help each other out. Isn't that right?" Charles wet his feverish lips. "What's all this about?" The doctor bent over him. "I've got to tell you this, doctor. Oh, I've just got to," he cried. "What would happen? Oh, just pretend, please pretend, that just like in the old days, a lot of microbes got together and wanted to make a bunch and reproduced and made more. His white hands were on his chest now, crawling towards his throat. And they decided to take over a person, cried Charles. Take over a person? Yes, become a person. Me, my hands, my feet. What if a disease somehow knew how to kill a person and yet live after him? He screamed. The hands were on his neck. The doctor moved forward, shouting. At 9 o'clock, the doctor was escorted out to his car by the mother and father, who handed him his bag. They conversed in the cool night wind for a few minutes. Just be sure his hands are kept strapped to his legs, said the doctor. I don't want him hurting himself. Will he be all right, doctor? The mother held to his arm for a moment. He patted her shoulder. Haven't I been your family physician for 30 years? It's the fever. He imagines things. But those bruises on his throat, he almost choked himself. Just you keep him strapped. He'll be all right in the morning. The car moved off down the dark September road. At 3 in the morning, Charles was still awake in his small black room. The bed was damp under his head and his back. He was very warm. Now he no longer had any arms and legs, and his body was beginning to change. He did not move on the bed, but looked at the vast blank ceiling space with insane concentration. For a while he had screamed and thrashed, but now he was weak and hoarse from it, and his mother had gotten up a number of times to soothe his brow with a wet towel. Now he was silent, his hands strapped to his legs. He felt the walls of his body change, the organs shift, the lungs catch fire like burning bellows of pink alcohol. The room was lighted up as with the flickerings of a hearth. Now he had no body. It was all gone. It was under him, but it was filled with the vast pulse of some burning, lethargic drug. It was as if a guillotine had neatly lopped off his head, and his head lay shining on a midnight pillow while the body below, still alive, belonged to somebody else. The disease had eaten his body, and from the eating had reproduced itself in feverish duplicate. There were the little hand hairs, and the fingernails, and the scars, and the toenails, and the tiny mole in his right hip, all done again in perfect fashion. I am dead, he thought. I've been killed, and yet I live. My body is dead. It is all disease, and nobody will know. I will walk around, and it will not be me. It will be something else. It will be something all bad, all evil. So big and so evil it's hard to understand or think about. Someday, that will buy shoes, and drink water, and get married someday maybe, and do more evil in the world than has ever been done. Now the warmth was stealing up his neck, into his cheeks, like a hot wine. His lips burned, his eyelids like leaves caught fire. His nostrils breathed out blue flame, faintly, faintly. This will be all, he thought. It'll take my head and my brain and fix each eye and every tooth and all the marks in my brain and every hair and every wrinkle in my ears, and there'll be nothing left of me. He felt his brain fill up with a boiling mercury. He felt his left eye clench in upon itself and, like a snail, withdraw, shift. He was blind in his left eye. It no longer belonged to him. It was enemy territory. His tongue was gone, cut out. His left cheek was numbed, lost. His left ear stopped hearing. It belonged to someone else now. The thing that was being born, this mineral thing replacing the wooden log, this disease replacing healthy animal cell. He tried to scream, and he was able to scream loud and high and sharply in the room, just as his brain flooded down. His right eye and right ear were cut out. He was blind and deaf, all fire, all terror, all panic, all death. His scream stopped before his mother ran through the door to his side. It was a good, clear morning, with a brisk wind that helped carry the doctor up the path before the house. In the window above, the boy stood, fully dressed. He did not wave when the doctor waved, and called, "What's this? Up? My goodness!" The doctor almost ran upstairs. He came gasping into the bedroom. "What are you doing out of bed?" he demanded of the boy. He tapped his thin chest, took his pulse and temperature. "Absolutely amazing! Normal!" "I shall never be sick again in all my life," declared the boy quietly, standing there, looking out the wide window. "Never." "I hope not. Why, you're looking fine, Charles." "Doctor." "Yes, Charles." "Can I go to school now?" asked Charles. "Tomorrow will be time enough. You sound positively eager." "I am. I like school. All the kids. I want to play with them and wrestle with them and spit on them and play with the girls' pigtails and shake the teacher's hand and rub my hands on all the cloaks in the cloakroom. And I want to grow up and travel and shake hands with people all over the world and be married and have lots of children and go to libraries and handle books. And all of that I want to," said the boy, looking off into the September morning. "What's the name you called me?" "What?" The doctor puzzled. "I called you nothing but Charles." "It's better than no name at all, I guess." The boy shrugged. "I'm glad you want to go back to school," said the doctor. "I really anticipate it," smiled the boy. "Thank you for your help, doctor. Shake hands?" "Glad to." They shook hands gravely, and the clear wind blew through the open window. They shook hands for almost a minute, the boy smiling up at the old man and thanking him. Then, laughing, the boy raced the doctor downstairs and out to his car. His mother and father followed for a happy farewell. "Fit as a fiddle," said the doctor. "Incredible." "And strong," said the father. "He got out of his straps himself during the night, didn't you, Charles?" "Did I?" said the boy. "You did. How?" "Oh," the boy said, "that was a long time ago." "A long time ago." They all laughed, and while they were laughing, the quiet boy moved his bare foot on the sidewalk and merely brushed against a number of red ants that were scurrying about on the sidewalk. Secretly, his eyes shining, while his parents chatted with the old man, he saw the ants hesitate, quiver, and lie still on the cement. He sensed they were cold now. "Goodbye!" The doctor drove away, waving. The boy walked ahead of his parents. As he walked, he looked away toward the town and began to hum "School Days" under his breath. "It's good to have him well again," said the father. Listen to him. He's so looking forward to school." The boy turned quietly. He gave each of his parents a crushing hug. He kissed them both several times. Then, without a word, he bounded up the steps into the house. In the parlor, before the others entered, he quickly opened the bird cage, thrust his hand in, and petted the yellow canary once. Then he shut the cage door, stood back, and waited. And that was Fever Dream by Ray Bradbury. All right, and now we have one last story. It's a different kind of scary than the others. Sometimes the scariness in a story can creep up on you when you least expect it. And that's true in The Lottery by Shirley Jackson. The morning of June 27th was clear and sunny with the fresh warmth of a full summer day. The flowers were blossoming profusely and the grass was richly green. The people of the village began to gather in the square between the post office and the bank around 10 o'clock. In some towns, there were so many people that the lottery took 2 days and had to be started on June 26th. But in this village, where there were only about 300 people, the whole lottery took only about 2 hours. So it could begin at 10 o'clock in the morning and still be through in time to allow the villagers to get home for noon dinner. The children assembled first, of course. School was recently over for the summer, and the feeling of liberty sat uneasily on most of them. They tended to gather together quietly for a while before they broke into boisterous play, and their talk was still of the classroom and the teacher, of books and reprimands. Bobby Martin had already stuffed his pockets full of stones, and the other boys soon followed his example, selecting the smoothest and roundest stones. Bobby and Harry Jones and Dickie Delacroix, the villagers pronounced this name Delacroix, eventually made a great pile of stones in one corner of the square and guarded it against the raids of the other boys. The girls stood aside, talking among themselves, looking over their shoulders at the boys, and the very small children rolled in the dust or clung to the hands of their older brothers or sisters. Soon the men began to gather, surveying their own children, speaking of planting and of rain, tractors and taxes. They stood together away from the pile of stones in the corner, and their jokes were quiet, and they smiled rather than laughed. The women, wearing faded house dresses and sweaters, came shortly after their menfolk. They greeted one another and exchanged bits of gossip as they went to join their husbands. Soon the women, standing by their husbands, began to call to their children, and the children came reluctantly, having to be called 4 or 5 times. Bobby Martin ducked under his mother's grasping hand and ran, laughing, back to the pile of stones. His father spoke up sharply, and Bobby came quickly and took his place between his father and his oldest brother. The lottery was conducted, as were the square dances, the teenage club, the Halloween program, by Mr. Summers, who had time and energy to devote to civic activities. He was a round-faced, jovial man and ran the coal business, and people were very sorry for him because he had no children and his wife was a scold. When he arrived in the square, carrying the black wooden box, there was a murmur of conversation among the villagers, and he waved and called, "Little late today, folks." The postmaster, Mr. Graves, followed him, carrying a 3-legged stool, and the stool was put in the center of the square, and Mr. Summers set the black box down on it. The villagers kept their distance, leaving space between themselves and the stool, and when Mr. Summers said, "Some of you fellows want to give me a hand?" there was a hesitation, for 2 men, Mr. Martin and his oldest son, Baxter, came forward to hold the box steady on the stool while Mr. Summers stirred up the papers inside it. The original paraphernalia for the lottery had been lost long ago, and the black box now resting on the stool had been put into use even before Old Man Warner, the oldest man in town, was born. Mr. Summers spoke frequently to the villagers about making a new box, but no one liked to upset even as much tradition as was represented by the black box. There was a story that the present box had been made with some pieces of the box that preceded it, the one that had been constructed when the first people settled down to make a village here. Every year after the lottery, Mr. Summers began talking again about a new box, but every year the subject was allowed to fade without anything being done. The black box grew shabbier each year. By now, it was no longer completely black, but splintered badly along one side to show the original wood color, and in some places faded or stained. Mr. Martin and his oldest son, Baxter, held the black box securely on the stool until Mr. Summers had stirred the papers thoroughly with his hand. Because so much of the ritual had been forgotten or discarded, Mr. Summers had been successful in having slips of paper substituted for the chips of wood that had been used for generations. Chips of wood, Mr. Summers had argued, had been all very well when the village was tiny, but now that the population was more than 300 and likely to keep on growing, it was necessary to use something that would fit more easily in the black box. The night before the lottery, Mr. Summers and Mr. Graves made up slips of paper and put them in the box, and then it was taken to the safe of Mr. Summers' coal company and locked up until Mr. Summers was ready to take it to the square next morning. The rest of the year the box was put away, sometimes one place, sometimes another. It had spent 1 year in Mr. Graves's barn and another year underfoot in the post office, and sometimes it was set on a shelf in the Martin grocery store and left there. There was a great deal of fussing to be done before Mr. Summers declared the lottery open. There were the lists to make up of heads of families, heads of households in each family, members of each household of each family. There was the proper swearing in of Mr. Summers by the postmaster as the official of the lottery. At one time, some people remembered, there had been a recital of some sort, performed by the official of the lottery, a perfunctory, tuneless chant that had been rattled off duly each year. Some people believed that the official of the lottery used to stand just so when he said or sang it. Others believed that he was supposed to walk among the people, but years and years ago this part of the ritual had been allowed to lapse. There had been also a ritual salute, which the official of the lottery had had to use in addressing each person who came up to draw from the box. But this also had changed with time, until now it felt necessary only for the official to speak to each person approaching. Mr. Summers was very good at all this. In his clean white shirt and blue jeans, with one hand resting carelessly on the black box, he seemed very proper and important, as he talked interminably to Mr. Graves and the Martins. Just as Mr. Summers finally left off talking and turned to the assembled villagers, Mrs. Hutchinson came hurriedly along the path to the square, her sweater thrown over her shoulders, and slid into place in the back of the crowd. "Clean forgot what day it was?" she said to Mrs. Delacroix, who stood next to her, and both laughed softly. "Thought my old man was out back stacking wood," Mrs. Hutchinson went on. "And then when I looked out the window and the kids was gone, and then I remembered it was the 27th and came a-running." She dried her hands on her apron, and Mrs. Delacroix said, "You're in time, though. They're still talking away up there." Mrs. Hutchinson craned her neck to see through the crowd, and found her husband and children standing near the front. She tapped Mrs. Delacroix on the arm as a farewell, and began to make her way through the crowd. The people separated good-humoredly to let her through. 2 or 3 people said, in voices just loud enough to be heard across the crowd, "Here comes your Mrs. Hutchinson," and "Bill, she made it after all." Mrs. Hutchinson reached her husband, and Mr. Summers, who had been waiting, said cheerfully, "Thought we were going to have to get on without you, Tessie." Mrs. Hutchinson said, grinning, "Wouldn't have me leave my dishes in the sink now, would you, Joe?" And soft laughter ran through the crowd as people stirred back into position after Mrs. Hutchinson's arrival. "Well now," Mr. Summers said soberly, "guess we better get started. Get this over with so's we can get back to work. Anybody ain't here?" "Dunbar," several people said. "Dunbar, Dunbar." Mr. Summers consulted his list. "Clyde Dunbar," he said. "That's right. He broke his leg, hasn't he? Who's drawing for him?" Me, I guess, a woman said, and Mr. Summers turned to look at her. Wife draws for her husband, Mr. Summers says. Don't you have a grown boy to do it for you, Janie? Although Mr. Summers and everyone else in the village knew the answer perfectly well, it was the business of the official of the lottery to ask such questions formally. Mr. Summers waited with an expression of polite interest while Mrs. Dunbar answered. Horace is not but 16 yet, Mrs. Dunbar said regretfully. Guess I gotta fill in for the old man this year. Right, said Mr. Summers. He made a note on the list he was holding. Then he asked, Watson boy drawing this year? A tall boy in the crowd raised his hand. Here, he said. I'm drawing for my mother and me. He blinked his eyes nervously and ducked his head as several voices in the crowd said things like, Good fellow, Jack, and glad to see your mother's got a man to do it. Well, Mr. Summers said, guess that's everyone. Old man Warner make it. Here, a voice said, and Mr. Summers nodded. A sudden hush fell on the crowd as Mr. Summers cleared his throat and looked at the list. All ready? He called. Now I'll read the names, heads of families first, and the men come up and take up paper out of the box. Keep the paper folded in your hand without looking at it until everyone has a turn. Everything clear? The people had done it so many times that they only half listened to the directions. Most of them were quiet, wetting their lips, not looking around. Then Mr. Summers raised one hand high and said, Adams. A man disengaged himself from the crowd and came forward. Hi, Steve, Mr. Summers said, and Mr. Adams said, Hi, Joe. They grinned at one another humorlessly and nervously. Then Mr. Adams reached into the black box and took out a folded paper. He held it firmly by one corner as he turned and went hastily back to his place in the crowd, where he stood a little apart from his family, not looking down at his hand. Allen, Mr. Summers said. Anderson, Bentham. Seems like there's no time at all between lotteries anymore, Mrs. Delacroix said to Mrs. Graves in the back row. Seems like we got through with the last one only last week. Time sure grows fast, Mrs. Graves said. Clark, Delacroix. There goes my old man, Mrs. Delacroix said. She held her breath while her husband went forward. Dunbar, Mr. Summers said, and Mrs. Dunbar went steadily to the box while one of the women said, Go on, Janie, and another one said, There she goes. We are next, Mrs. Graves said. She watched while Mr. Graves came around from the side of the box, greeted Mr. Summers gravely, and selected a piece of paper from the box. By now, all through the crowd there were men holding the small folded papers in their large hands, turning them over and over, nervously. Mrs. Dunbar and her two sons stood together, Mrs. Dunbar holding the slip of paper. Harbert, Hutchinson. Get up there, Bill, Mrs. Hutchinson said, and the people near her laughed. Jones? They do say, Mr. Adams said to old man Warner, who stood next to him, that over in the North Village they're talking of giving up the lottery. Old man Warner snorted. Pack of crazy fools, he said, listening to the young folks. Nothing's good enough for them. Next thing you know, they'll be wanting to go back to living in caves. Nobody work anymore. Live that way for a while. Used to be a saying about lottery in June, corn be heavy soon. First thing you know, we'd all be eating stewed chickweed and acorns. There's always been a lottery, he added petulantly. Bad enough to see young Joe Summers up there joking with everybody. Some places have already quit lotteries, Mrs. Adams said. Nothing but trouble in that, old man Warner said stoutly. Pack of young fools. Martin, and Bobby Martin watched his father go forward. Overdyke, Percy. I wish they'd hurry, Mrs. Dunbar said to her older son. I wish they'd hurry. They're almost through, her son said. You get ready to run tell Dad, Mrs. Dunbar said. Mr. Summers called his own name and then stepped forward precisely and selected a slip from the box. Then he called, Warner? 77th year I've been in the lottery, Old Man Warner said as he went through the crowd. 77th time. Watson? The tall boy came awkwardly through the crowd. Someone said, Don't be nervous, Jack. And Mr. Summers said, Take your time, son. Zanini. After that, there was a long pause, a breathless pause, until Mr. Summers, holding his slip of paper in the air, said, All right, fellows. For a minute, no one moved, and then all the slips of paper were opened. Suddenly, all the women began to speak at once, saying, Who is it? Who's got it? Is it the Dunbars? Is it the Watsons? The voices began to say, It's Hutchinson. It's Bill. Bill Hutchinson's got it. Go tell your father, Mrs. Dunbar said to her older son. People began to look around to see the Hutchinsons. Bill Hutchinson was standing quiet, staring down at the paper in his hand. Suddenly, Tessie Hutchinson shouted to Mr. Summers, You didn't give him enough time to take any paper he wanted. I saw you. It wasn't fair. Be a good sport, Tessie, Mrs. Delacroix called, and Mrs. Graves said, All of us took the same chance. Shut up, Tessie, Bill Hutchinson said. Well, everyone, Mr. Summers said, that was done pretty fast, and now we've got to be hurrying a little more to get done in time. He consulted his next list. Bill, he said, you draw for the Hutchinson family. You got any other households in the Hutchinsons? There's Don and Eva, Mrs. Hutchinson yelled. Make them take their chance. Daughters draw with their husbands' families, Tessie, Mr. Summers said gently. You know that as well as anyone else. It wasn't fair, Tessie said. I guess not, Joe, Bill Hutchinson said regretfully. My daughter draws with her husband's family, that's only fair. And I've got no other family except the kids. Then as far as drawing for families is concerned, it's you, Mr. Summers said in explanation. And as far as drawing for households is concerned, that's you too, right? Right, Bill Hutchinson said. How many kids, Bill? Mr. Summers asked formally. 3, Bill Hutchinson said. There's Bill Jr. and Nancy and little Dave and Tessie and me. All right then, Mr. Summers said. Harry, you got their tickets back? Mr. Graves nodded and held up the slips of paper. Put them in the box then, Mr. Summers directed. Take Bill's and put it in. I think we ought to start over, Mrs. Hutchinson said, as quietly as she could. I tell you it wasn't fair. You didn't give him time enough to choose. Everybody saw that. Mr. Graves had selected 5 slips and put them in the box, and he dropped all the papers but those onto the ground, where the breeze caught them and lifted them off. Listen, everybody, Mrs. Hutchinson was saying to the people around her. Ready, Bill? Mr. Summers asked, and Bill Hutchinson, with one quick glance around his wife and children, nodded. Remember, Mr. Summers said, take the slips and keep them folded until each person has taken one. Harry, you help little Dave. Mr. Graves took the hand of the little boy, who came willingly with him up to the box. Take a paper out of the box, Davy, Mr. Summers said. Davy put his hand into the box and laughed. Take just one paper, Mr. Summers said. Harry, you hold it for him. Mr. Graves took the child's hand and removed the folded paper from the tight fist and held it while little Dave stood next to him and looked up at him wonderingly. "Nancy next," Mr. Summers said. Nancy was 12, and her school friends breathed heavily as she went forward, swishing her skirt, and took a slip daintily from the box. "Bill Jr.," Mr. Summers said, and Billy, his face red and his feet overlarge, nearly knocked the box over as he got a paper out. "Tessie," Mr. Summers said. She hesitated for a minute, looking around defiantly, and then set her lips and went up to the box. She snatched a paper out and held it behind her. "Bill," Mr. Summers said, and Bill Hutchinson reached into the box and felt around, bringing his hand out at last with the slip of paper in it. The crowd was quiet. A girl whispered, "I hope it's not Nancy," and the sound of the whisper reached the edges of the crowd. "It's not the way it used to be," Old Man Warner said clearly. "People ain't the way they used to be." "All right," Mr. Summers said. "Open the papers. Harry, you open little Dave's." Mr. Graves opened the slip of paper, and there was a general sigh through the crowd as he held it up, and everyone could see that it was blank. Nancy and Bill Jr. opened theirs at the same time, and both beamed and laughed, turning around to the crowd and showing their slips of paper above their heads. "Tessie," Mr. Summers said. There was a pause, and then Mr. Summers looked at Bill Hutchinson, and Bill unfolded his paper and showed it. It was blank. "It's Tessie," Mr. Summers said, and his voice was hushed. "Show us her paper, Bill." Bill Hutchinson went over to his wife and forced the slip of paper out of her hand. It had a black spot on it, the black spot Mr. Summers had made the night before with a heavy pencil in the coal company office. Bill Hutchinson held it up, and there was a stir in the crowd. "All right, folks," Mr. Summers said. "Let's finish quickly." Although the villagers had forgotten the ritual and lost the original black box, they still remembered to use stones. The pile of stones the boys had made earlier was ready. There were stones on the ground, with the blowing scraps of paper that had come out of the box. Mrs. Delacroix selected a stone so large she had to pick it up with both hands, and turned to Mrs. Dunbar. "Come on," she said. "Hurry up." Mrs. Dunbar had small stones in both hands, and she said, gasping for breath, "I can't run at all. You'll have to go ahead and I'll catch up with you." The children had stones already, and someone gave little Davy Hutchinson a few pebbles. Tessie Hutchinson was in the center of a cleared space by now, and she held her hands out desperately as the villagers moved in on her. "It isn't fair," she said. A stone hit her on the side of the head. Old Man Warner was saying, come on, everyone." Steve Adams was in the front of the crowd of villagers, with Mrs. Graves beside him. "It isn't fair! It isn't right!" Mrs. Hutchinson screamed. And then they were upon her. And that was The Lottery by Shirley Jackson. Thank you for joining us for these spooky stories, and everyone have a wonderful Halloween.